Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert and we're going to go through the second target in this unit, and the target says that you should be able to identify and describe these parts that you'll find in every scientific experiment, and those are the control, the independent variable, and the dependent variable. So if you took integrated science last year, and even if you didn't, I'm sure you've had this before, these parts, the independent, dependent, and variables and the control. But I know that you'll remember that a hypothesis in science is a simple definition for it would be an educated guess about what you think will happen. Now here it says what you think will happen in an experiment. You could have maybe looked at some data and then made a hypothesis about why you think the data showed some patterns, the patterns that it did. So at any rate, you can write, one way to write a hypothesis is in the form of an if-then statement. So here you see an example. If I use a chemical fertilizer on some plants, then my plants will grow taller. That, of course, would be a hypothesis. If you write out a hypothesis that way, then one of the things that makes it a little easier is that first part of the hypothesis, the if portion, will help you figure out, because it will refer to then the independent variable. And there's different ways to define independent variable, dependent variable, and control. In fact, I'll bet you've had some definitions in the past for those that may have even caused some confusion. But one of the ways that I like to think of the independent variable is it's always what is being tested to see if it's going to make a difference. So here it says it's what's changed in the setup of the experiment. That's true. You can think of it as whatever treatment is being used. That's true as well. That's another way to think of it. And it also says that it's the difference in the setup from group to group. So anytime you do an experiment, you're going to have two groups at least. One of those groups is going to have the independent variable applied to it, and the other one is not. So, but if you always think of it and remember that it's what you're going to test to see if it makes a difference, that I think will help you. So if you look back at the if-then statement, if I use a chemical fertilizer, then my plants will grow taller. Now you might say, well, I'm testing the plants to see if they're going to grow taller. But remember, it's what you're testing to see if it will make a difference. So here we're testing a chemical fertilizer to see if that's going to make a difference in the growth of the plants, and so that's why it's the independent variable. Again, going back to that if-then statement, the then part of the hypothesis then refers to the dependent variable. And in every single experiment, the dependent variable is what is measured. You may have heard in the past that the dependent variable is what changes based on the independent variable, and that's also true. But if you think about what's being measured in an experiment, almost always that's going to point you towards the dependent variable. That will be the dependent variable. So again, going back to that hypothesis, if I use a chemical fertilizer, then my plants will grow taller. Well, certainly if you set this experiment up, you're going to measure the growth of the plants. And so that's why the growth or the height of the plants then in this example is the dependent variable. The control. Now you probably heard the control is the part of the experiment that doesn't change. And that, again, is true. That's one way of thinking of it. But for a lot of students, that causes confusion, because you might say, well, I'm going to not change the kind of plants that I use. I'm going to use daisies. And I'm not going to change the amount of water that I give the plants. And I'm not going to change the location that I put the plants in, because I don't want one to receive more light than the other one. And all those things are true and things that you want to keep constant, but that may confuse you in trying to figure out what the control is. As it says here, in any experimental setup, the control is the group that doesn't receive the treatment. So again, when you do an experiment, you're going to do it at least, you're going to set it up with at least two parts. One part is going to receive the independent variable. The other part is not. So the part of the experiment that is not getting the independent variable is always the control. Another good way to think of the control, it's the part of the experiment that I'm going to compare my results to see if my independent variable made a difference. So in our example, again, with the plants, we're going to set one group up of plants that's going to get the chemical fertilizer. We're going to set another group up that's going to be the same kind of plants. They're going to get the same amount of water, same amount of sunlight, but we're going to withhold the chemical fertilizer. And then, of course, we're going to let them grow for a certain period of time. We're going to measure their growth. And then I'm going to compare the growth of the plants that received the fertilizer to the group that didn't get the fertilizer. So the control in this case is the group of plants that didn't get the fertilizer, or the growth of the plants that didn't get the fertilizer. And that's how you'll know if the fertilizer made a difference. So this particular target, I find, is one that a large number of students, or a significant number of students, find difficult. This is not something that you're going to need to know only for this Introduction to Biology unit. You're going to be using this skill throughout the year, including on the final exam. So, like anything else, if you're struggling to learn something, it helps to practice it. So these are some different resources that you can use, and you'll find these in the Intro to Biology folder. Um, to help you learn this skill of identifying the independent variable, dependent variable, and the control. And I would encourage you to use as many of these resources and others that I've placed on Schoology to help you learn this target, because again, you're going to need to know this throughout the year. We'll be using it again and again and again. So like everything else, if you have any questions, please make sure you ask either in class, before class, or after class, or during my office hours.